Good evening, welcome to Novara Live. Coming up on tonight's show, Emmanuel Macron is talking tough on Trump's threats to annex Greenland. The ceasefire between Syrian and Kurdish-led forces appears to be crumbling. We'll discuss the British turncoats supporting Donald Trump. And bizarrely, Donald Trump's free speech czar has told the UK to stop arresting Palestine Action supporters. I am, of course, Aaron Bastani, and tonight I'm joined down the line this time by Kieran and Andrieu. Kieran, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Aaron. I coincidentally am about 10 miles from the border of a kingdom that isn't used to being in the international headlines as much as it is at the moment, namely Denmark. So yeah, I'm doing well, and it's interesting to be here at the moment.
So you're in Malmö in Sweden, right?
Correct. I'm in Malmö in Sweden, but so very close to the Danish border, but in Malmö, yeah.
But you know, in Swedish, you're meant to say Malmö.
Malmö? No, I didn't know that. No wonder I've been getting funny looks the whole time I've been here. If only I'd asked you before.
There you go. Well, what I find interesting is that pronunciation is quite similar to the northeast of England, right? So if you ask somebody like Ian Lavery, you know, if you showed him the word Malmö, go Malmö. But it's also the correct pronunciation. Interesting. Anyway, let's talk about something serious. If you'd like to support our work here at Novara Media, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. We're building the people's army, Michael Walker's Barmy Army. As ever, don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments, use super chats, or just let me know what you think on YouTube. Regardless, this show is not all about you, but mostly. Let's get on to our first story of this evening. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has so far adopted a softly approach with US President Donald Trump over his threat of massive sanctions on countries that object to his pursuit of Greenland. And who can really blame Starmer? After all, we're pretty isolated, and successive British governments have made us deeply reliant on US trade relations. But in Europe, a massive trade bloc containing around 500 million consumers, it's a different story altogether, with some of its leaders talking pretty tough. Here's French President Emmanuel Macron speaking at Davos today.
Without collective governance, cooperation gives way to relentless competition. Competition from the United States of America through trade agreements that undermine our export interests, demand maximum concessions, and openly aim to weaken and subordinate Europe, combined with an endless accumulation of new tariffs that are fundamentally unacceptable. Even more so when they are used as leverage against territorial sovereignty. I think accepting a sort of new colonial approach doesn't make sense. And all the head of state and government and business leaders, which would be too complacent with such an approach, will take a huge responsibility.
Now, I don't know about you. Those were very important words you were saying. It's a big story. We're covering it tonight. But I couldn't take my eyes off his sunglasses. The French, what a people. Right? Daft Punk. There was a little hint of Eric Cantona. The seagulls follow the troller. I think, what a people. This guy's the president. He looks like Sebastian Tellier. He looks like he's about to, he's promoting some electronica night. Good for him, I say. Of course, just because Macron is talking tough on stage doesn't mean he's not doing diplomacy behind the scenes. That's a fact President Trump appeared to confirm last night when he leaked these private messages from Macron on his social media platform, Truth Social. From President Macron to President Trump, just for people listening on the podcast, these are screenshots, like I say, of private messages. My friend, this is, again, I won't do a French accent, you can imagine. We are totally in line on Syria. We can do great things on Iran. I do not understand what you're doing on Greenland. Let us try to build great things. 1, I can set up a G7 meeting after Davos in Paris on Thursday afternoon. I can invite the Ukrainians, the Danish, the Syrians, and the Russians in the margins. 2, let us have dinner together in Paris on Thursday before you go back to the US, Emmanuel. But there was one moment in that speech where Macron made a statement particularly likely to enrage Trump.
China is welcome, but what we need is more Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe, in some key sectors to contribute to our growth, to transfer some technologies, and not just to export towards Europe some devices or products which sometimes don't have the same standards or are much more subsidized as the one being produced in Europe.
And now that message from Macron was included in that speech for a reason. It's a warning. If the US tries to dominate Europe, then Trump's major enemy could quickly become the friend of Brussels. And it comes quick on the heels of another American ally making similar overtures this weekend. Last week, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney visited Beijing to seal a new trade framework between Canada, the country he governs, and China. It was a move widely seen as a bid to wean Canada off its trade dependency on its southern neighbour, while also signalling to the West that an economic change of direction was possible. This was Carney speaking after signing that deal.
I'm pleased today to announce that Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs. This is a return to the levels that existed prior to recent trade frictions. But it's a return under an agreement that promises much more for Canadians. It's expected that within 3 years, this agreement will drive considerable Chinese investment in Canada's auto sector, creating good careers in Canada and accelerating our progress towards a net zero future and the auto industry of the future.
Now that was an extraordinary statement. No Canadian PM had been to China for more than a decade. In 2024, Justin Trudeau, at the prompting of the Americans, had put a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. That's now gone down to 6% for the first 49,000 vehicles, but it's basically going to grow over time. That 49,000 in the years ahead will basically become as many cars as they can buy. And that's a major, major step because, of course, if you want to buy a cheap EV and you're an American national, you can go to Canada, right? A major step. Now, what's also key there is the fact Carney was talking about cooperation between China and Canada in manufacturing EVs in Canada. He's saying, look, use us as a base of operations for producing Chinese electric vehicles, whether it's BYD or Geely or Xiaomi, and potentially, when there's a more amenable administration to the south, who knows? You might be able to export them to the United States. Huge, huge steps. Very brave, very ambitious. We'll talk about Carney and his view on things more broadly in a moment, but none of this should be taken lightly. Also, don't forget, in 2017-18, Canada was the country that arrested the daughter of the CEO of Huawei at the prompting of the FBI. They've gone from utter subordination to the US security state and done a 180 in less than a decade. Why? Because Trump 2.0 is serious. Elites are no longer saying, oh, it's just one-off. This is the US electoral system playing games. We'll deal with it. It won't happen again. This is the Republican Party, and this is how the Canadians are dealing with it. It's presumably no coincidence that less than a week after signing that deal, Canadian newspaper The Globe and Mail reported this extraordinary story today. The Canadian military has begun modelling responses to a hypothetical US invasion, though leaders have also stressed the possibility that one remains unlikely. Macron won't be the only European leader looking towards China today, and his speech came just hours after Trump tried to bully the French into accepting a place on his board of peace. That's the organisation that Trump began in order to govern the reconstruction of Gaza, which has since ballooned into a kind of shadow UN. It also charges countries $1 billion for permanent membership. In response to an invitation to join, the French government said they believed the organisation would undermine the United Nations. Trump immediately fired back with this threat.
Oh, did he say that? Well, nobody wants him because he's going to be out of office very soon. So, that's all right. What I'll do is if they feel like Costo, I'll put a 200% tariff on his wines and champagnes, and he'll join. But he doesn't have to join.
Before we go on, he'll be replaced by somebody else. Yeah, it's going to either be from the left, and believe me, they're not going to be more amenable to you, Donald, or from the right, and Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella are pretty much the most pro-Europe sovereignty politicians on the European right. So Macron isn't in any way at odds with the French political class, let alone the French people. Macron's speech seemed to contain a reference to that point.
And here in the epicenter of this continent, we do believe that we need more growth, we need more stability in this world. But we do prefer respect to bullies, We do prefer science to plotism, and we do prefer rule of law to brutality. You're welcome in Europe, and you are more than welcome to France.
I should say before we carry on that I wasn't just mocking Monsieur Macron's eyes and his choice of eyewear. He has had a black eye, a bloodshot eye in recent days. The choice, however, of Ray-Bans with a reflective blue surface, I thought is quite brave nonetheless. Now, it's not just Emmanuel Macron who's been taking a harder line on Trump's recent moves. Belgian Prime Minister Bart De Wever had this to say about the American president.
And I think Europe is at a crossroads where it has to decide. Until now, we tried to appease the new president in the White House. We were very lenient, also with the tariffs. We were lenient, hoping to get his support for the Ukraine war. We are in a very bad position at the moment. We're dependent on the United States, so we chose to be lenient. But now so many red lines are being crossed that you have the choice between your self-respect. Being a happy vassal is one thing, being a miserable slave is something else. If you back down now, you're going to lose your dignity. And that's probably the most precious thing you can have in a democracy. It's your dignity. So we should unite, and we should say to Donald Trump, I'm going to meet him tomorrow. The meeting was fixed before the Greenland issue. So
looking forward to it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward. The king will accompany me on the... I'm looking at the queen who's sitting in the front row. Our king will accompany me at the meeting, but it will have a different character than we had planned. It will probably be the message that we have to send. You're crossing red lines here. We either stand together or we will stand divided. And if we are divided, there is the end of an era of 80 years of Atlantism is really drawing to a close. And, you know, as Gramsci said, if the old is dying and the new is not yet born, you live in a time of monsters.
Not on my 2026 bingo card, the Prime Minister of Belgium quoting Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist, at Davos. Also speaking at Davos was European Commission leader Ursula von der Leyen, who, without mentioning Trump by name, spoke about the opportunities that seismic shifts in the geopolitical order presented for Europe.
But the truth is also that we will only be able to capitalize on this opportunity if we recognize that this change is permanent. Of course, nostalgia is part of our human story, but nostalgia will not bring back the old order. And playing for time and hoping for things to revert soon will not fix the structural dependencies we have. So my point is, if this change is permanent, then Europe must change permanently too. It is time to seize this opportunity and build a new independent Europe.
What's going on? They sound serious for once. They sound serious. I hear all these speeches by the Belgian PM, by Macron, even von der Leyen, and do you know who comes to mind? Mao. This is the rhetoric of third worldism, and I say that in a positive way. We will no longer genuflect and subordinate our interests. That's the hegemon. It's the great power. We'll be self-reliant. You heard from the Belgian PM this idea of not just independence, but also integrity, decency. But it's no longer kind of liberal coded, right? It sounds much more third worldist. We will throw off the shackles of American imperium. They're not saying that. I mean, Carney's coming pretty close. But that seems to be where they're heading. Kieran, what's your thoughts on all this? I mean, look, in the punditry game, people love to say, this is extraordinary, it's never happened before. This is extraordinary. Europe's politicians haven't talked like this about America, as was mentioned there by von der Leyen, for 80 years.
Yeah. There's a few things. I mean, first of all, if Europe does want to flex its muscles against the United States, it has a great deal of wherewithal to do so. And I think that's partly what's been so frustrating over the past 2 years or so, is seeing the European leaders following the American and Israeli line in the context of the destruction of Gaza, is the knowledge that actually Europe does have dormant and active resources and wherewithal sufficient to actually stand up to the US. It doesn't mean it's equal to the power of the United States. It's not. It doesn't have the same degree of institutional or political coherence as the United States. It can't act with a single voice in the same way that the United States can. It doesn't have, it's not a hegemon equal to the United States, but it does have a great deal of wherewithal. And one thing that Macron referenced today, he looked to me like Maverick from Top Gun, by the way. One thing he referenced today was the anti-coercion instrument, which is a kind of nuclear option devised by the European Union, which is yet to be used, and I think was passed in 2023. And basically, it's a set of emergency economic kind of barriers that the EU could erect, and it would take some time for the Commission to deliberate it, but could erect within 2 or 3 months, which, at least in theory, I don't see why it couldn't be in practice, would prevent the United States from procuring contracts in the EU, would freeze all existing contracts that the US has with the EU, that would prevent exports and imports from the US to the EU. Those two blocks, I mean, the US and the EU are the two most important trading partners in the world still. Whatever the rise of China means in terms of circuits of trade elsewhere, that transatlantic trade is still the most valuable and important trade in the world. I think in 2023 was worth $1.6 trillion. And there's a relative trade equilibrium between the US and the EU as well. It's not like one has a massive trade surplus or trade deficit overall. And I think something like 6 or 7 million US jobs are directly dependent on trade with the EU in goods and services in various ways. That's a lot of leverage. That is a lot of leverage. And that's before we start to talk about US military bases, which of course have been mentioned by various political leaders in the European Union over the past few days and indeed weeks. So I think it's in a difficult situation, the European Union, on this, but it has muscle to flex. And yeah, you're right. It's nice to hear that, but I do want to just throw out a pretty important caveat, Aaron, which is that, I mean, even Macron's leaked messages, I mean, that's an unbelievable dick move, by the way, from Trump to leak his text. But anyway, even in those messages, you've got Macron saying, we're aligned on Iran, we're aligned on Syria, I don't understand what you're doing with Greenland. Then you've got the Belgian PM saying, red lines have been crossed. Then you've got Ursula von der Leyen saying, you know, this is a Rubicon moment. We're crossing a point of no return here, Donald, and so on. And I just think to myself, actually, it is pretty clear that the objection is that this is directly affecting European sovereignty and European interests. It's not so much that it is a violation of international law. And of course, I do think about Palestine. I think about the red lines being crossed that the Belgian PM refers to. Well, hello, you know, every single red line of war crime or violation of humanitarian principles and law, genocide is being committed in Gaza. And the international community cheered it on and partnered with it in Europe. So it is pretty difficult to see this as a genuine revolt against US colonialism, as Macron wants us to believe. I think the only conclusion, I'm not just saying this to sound radical, the only empirical conclusion is that European sovereignty and European mainland is the distinguishing marker.
I mean, I do agree with you, but I'd also say, look, to be charitable to von der Leyen or to Macron, I suspect lots of them thought this was a long time coming, and Greenland is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. You look at Russia in Crimea and Ukraine and in Georgia, you look at Israel, Palestine, and I suppose it's all additive, isn't it? And you have a picture, which is that world order, which we've grown up in, it's all we've known since 1945, is kind of in decline. I think people have been saying it for a very long time, and they've been right to say it, but I do think the Greenland thing is just extraordinary. Denmark is a country of 6 million people. They spent $4.5 billion on F-35s, right? The equivalent in this country with 68 million people would be, what, 50 billion on F-35s. And Trump is briefing journalists on Air Force One saying all they have to protect Greenland is 2 dog sleds. You're a country of 6 million people that spends $4.5 billion on about 40 fighter jets, and that's the response you get. By the way, that's creating a hell of a lot of jobs in the United States. I do feel like it's a straw that's broken a camel's back, and with good reason. This is such a great story. We're going to talk about it more. Before I do, though, I also just want to talk about those sunglasses. Europe is so back, right? We've got kind of politicians with big fat ties and, aviators, and some people in the comments saying he looks like something from Top Gun. I was almost expecting to hear, Playing with the Boys break out while he was talking on stage. Europe is back, people. Also speaking at Davos today was British Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who appeared on a panel with US Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick. Lutnick set out his vision of the US's new economic and political strategy.
The point I want to make, and I want people to think about, is that America First is the job of our government to take care of our workers, to make sure their lives are better for it. And then, don't be America alone, right? But be America first. And I would suggest that policy is something for other countries to deeply consider, to take care of their own, and then we will work out wonderful relationships between us. But I want to point out, when America shines, the world shines. Close your eyes and think of a world without America in it. It becomes pretty dark, pretty darn quickly. When America shines, right? And everyone said, oh, you're going to do all these tariffs, you're going to destroy the world. The world's stock markets are up. Which ones of them? All of them.
And this was Reeves' response to that quite extraordinary statement.
If you say, could you picture the world without the US and what would the world be like? Yeah, the world would be a lot poorer and it would be a lot scarier. But you've also got a lot of allies around the world. In the United States, Britain, I believe, is your strongest ally. Always has been.
First, you do a deal with us, and we love you. We do.
Thank you very much. Feeling is mutual, but we do need to think about where the threats are and who our friends are. And I think that's probably more stark for smaller economies. But even for the US, when you think about, I was in the States, as you know, last week for a meeting of G7 plus a few other finance ministers to talk around critical minerals. Now, you do have some reserves of critical minerals, but not everything you need. 90% of your critical minerals at the moment come from the US, from China. You need to wean yourself off those.
Sure.
Yeah, but you won't be able to do that without the help of Canada and Australia and other countries. And so, for all of your strengths, we do also need to think how we can preserve some of the things that the US has benefited from in the NATO alliance and the Western alliance, not because it is the benevolent or the right thing to do, but because I profoundly believe it is in your country's national interest.
Rachel Reeves is talking sense for once. Who looks at the last 80 years in the whole, when the United States has been this major power, one of the two major powers until 1989-90, the world's, unrivaled power since 1990, this unipolar moment of one hyperpower, no rivals. Who looks at the last 80 years and says, you know what, that's been a terrible time for America. They've not invented anything new. They've not amassed incredible amounts of wealth. They've not exerted diplomatic and political and military power and influence over vast swathes of the planet. Who thinks that? The last 25 years have been extraordinary for US tech companies. Meta, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, they've done so well out of US empire. What do you want? You've got half a dozen companies worth more than $1 trillion. What do you want? What do you want? They still feel they're put upon. Oh my God, we're victims. We're victims because we've got so many multi-trillion-dollar companies. We're victims because the entire world buys US treasuries, which finances US deficits, which means we can spend far more than we actually bring in through tax. We're so put upon. How dare you? How dare the rest of the world finance American expenditure? How dare you? How dare you use dollars if you want to conduct trade between two parties anywhere in the world? If Russia and China want to do some trade, historically they've used dollars. They've had to use dollars. They've had to acquire those dollars from the United States. How dare you? How dare you? Imagine being British, end of the 19th century, and saying, we've had a terrible century. Let's rip it all up. People would look at you and say, you're insane. This is the high watermark of British Empire. Everything is in our favour. Well, that's exactly what the US is doing right now. At a separate event, Reeves also warned her European counterparts to keep cool heads over Trump's Greenland threats. Now, you might think that Reeves was being pretty sensible in that exchange you saw a moment ago with Lutnick. Or you might think she's being just a little bit naive. Canada's Prime Minister gave a speech of a very different character.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
Wow, Mark Carney. The Anglophone world's found its Charles de Gaulle, right? Ex-central banker for Canada, ex-governor of the Bank of England for the UK, ex-Goldman. Who would have thought this would be the person saying, this is not business as usual? The global economic system is being weaponized. It is, by the way. I said this, I think, 2 weeks ago. On this show, the weapon of mass destruction par excellence built by the United States over the last 30 years is the global economy. That's how they're killing Iran. You don't need a nuclear weapon. You sanction the central bank. You put, blocks on SWIFT. You sanction any business that conducts trade with Iran. You arrest the daughter of the CEO of Huawei because they were trying to build 4G in the country. You don't need nukes. You don't need regime change. You can just strangle that country's economy. And here's where it gets really important. The exact same playbook of that weaponization of the global economy to kill places like Venezuela and Iran is now slowly being turned. That's the trial here anyway, right? Is slowly being turned on the West. There are people saying that, there should be sanctions on the UK. You've even got, we'll talk about this later in another story. The UK should be sanctioned for saying this about Trump. Starmer should be kidnapped like Maduro. I mean, these people are, by the way, that's criminal to do that. It's treachery, right? We won't go into that. But these tools are being turned against what were hitherto the allies of the United States. But it's absolutely incredible that a former governor of the Bank of England and a Prime Minister of Canada is saying precisely that. Incredible, correct analysis. I was not expecting it from an ex-Goldman guy. But you know what? I'll take it. That's language you don't expect to hear from a world leader at Davos either. Just the use of it there at this time really does suggest things are changing. Kieran, I mentioned third worldist kind of rhetoric in a positive way, self-reliance, independence, end subordination, dignity as well from the Belgian PM. This is the stuff that, Deng Xiaoping and Mao was saying in the 20s and 30s. Now it's being used by the Western Europeans and the Canadians. What do you make of it?
I suppose, you're right, but I suppose the distinction is that when they were using it, they hadn't spent the previous 80 years going along with the imperium or the colonial or imperial order that had subordinated most of the world. So I think there is obviously a strong degree of hypocrisy going on. I think it's worth reiterating that. I don't disagree, though, Aaron, that this is definitely a step change and a very significant. We're in the middle of a very significant shift. And you know what? It's extremely frustrating to me to hear Mark Carney speaking almost absolute truth about the kind of partialness of the international order, the kind of chaotic and biased way in which international law and humanitarian principles were applied and upheld. And it's also frustrating hearing Rachel Reeves speaking. So it's because you kind of think, well, if they're capable of saying these things, and Rachel Reeves was excellent in that clip. I mean, I never, ever thought I would say that with a straight face. Rachel Reeves was excellent in that clip. She managed to do the dance with a very powerful representative of the US government in front of people live, presumably unscripted. And you kind of think, well, where have these people been? Mark Carney is obviously an impressive guy in his field, but it seems that the threat that US, ultimately I see as the decline of US imperialism, the threats that it's bearing upon Europe with are kicking its political class into action and actually raising their game, raising their quality and the quality of their analysis. And that's great, fine. But it's a shame that it takes that for it to happen. I don't disagree that this is definitely a significant shift. And I think the way in which it's most significant, you've alluded to it, Aaron, is that this is going to it's going to recalibrate all the old alliances, because Europe isn't going to become non-aligned. If this continues, it will shift closer and closer into the orbit of China. And the irony there, well, there are many ironies, but just one, in reference to something I mentioned earlier, is the anti-coercion instrument that the EU developed as its nuclear option for economic warfare was designed specifically with China in mind. It was designed as a way of staving off Chinese dumping in the EU, price gouging, various other economic means of warfare. It was specifically done to align the EU closer to the United States contra China. And the extraordinary thing about all this, I mean, we heard it with Carney, but it's going to be replicated across Europe, I'm sure. The extraordinary thing about this is that in the space of 2 years since that legislation was passed, it might be deployed against the United States as the bloc moves closer to China. That's extremely significant. I don't think that it heralds a kind of anti-colonial struggle or anti-imperial struggle. I think it heralds a breakdown of the international order of the past 80 years and a move towards a kind of realist realignment.
Just to be clear, I don't think that we're looking at an anti-colonial struggle at Davos. But the rhetoric is markedly similar. There's a super chat from @WherePilgrim, mere words. In the case of Carney, they're not. That's the point, right? They're not. They've just done a deal with the Chinese on EVs. They've got visa-free travel between the two countries. So they're not mere words. That's a huge step. China's reduced tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports to China. They're deepening economic ties. Carney says that he wants to double Canadian trade by value by 2030 beyond the US. And of course, China is the world's other huge market, Europe as well. So they're not just mere words. Another comment, Yvonne, they are just mere words from the rest of the notes so far. Yvonne Butterfly Girl, Starmer is acting like a modern day Chamberlain. You know what? Chamberlain at least commissioned the Spitfire and radar and built stuff. You know, he fortified Singapore, not that it made any difference in the end. What's Starmer doing? What is Starmer doing to prepare us for a post-global world? In other words, a world beyond the 1945 institutions that were led on by the United States and its allies. If those are no longer reigning supreme, as I think is being correctly diagnosed by Mark Carney, what are we doing about it? Our payment systems are dependent on the Americans, from Visa to Apple Pay. Our basic infrastructure is dependent upon the Americans, from network servers to digital tools like YouTube or the Google document I'm looking at right now. My computer is Apple. How many stores out there are owned by US firms? If you want to buy a coffee on the high street, guess what? Costa, Nero, Starbucks are all US owned. So we need to clearly build in some resilience to the UK economy, given all of that. We need to start somewhere. Where are we starting? We haven't. So if he was Chamberlain, he'd be talking softly, but still doing stuff. We're not even there. Starmer is worse than Chamberlain, is what I'm trying to say. The world may be shifting on its political axes, but some things remain the same, like January being the month for sales. And so it is at our merch shop here at Novara. Head to shop.novaramedia.com and take advantage of big savings in our very own store. We've got clothes, mugs, books, badges, and more, with up to £20 off. I'm wearing a Novara t-shirt right now. I wear these all the time. You know why? Great supply chains, very comfortable. I'm not going to find a better t-shirt on the market. I've even asked for an unbranded one. You can't do that, apparently. These are fantastic clothes, books, gifts. I can't recommend supporting our work in any other way by actually becoming a supporter than buying our merch. That sale runs until the end of January, so grab a bargain while you can. Go to shop.novaramedia.com. Support our work. The autonomous Kurdish area of northeastern Syria, known as Rojava, appears to be in imminent danger. That's after fighters associated with the Syrian transitional government, led by Syria's president, former jihadist Ahmed al-Shara, also known as Jalani, has begun attacking areas held by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, the armed force of Rojava. Rojava, shown here in yellow, is the self-governing region of northeastern Syria. Since the transfer of power in Damascus to al-Shara last year, the new Syrian government has pursued a path of distinctively Arab unity in the country, making few concessions to minority groups. Rojava, however, has held out, entering negotiations with the government but insisting on permanent constitutional recognition for the project, as well as a degree of self-governance. Rojava's military, the SDF, is, on paper at least, an ally of the US and other Western powers, having been essential in the years-long mission to eliminate ISIS from the region, at the loss of thousands of its own personnel. But now, those powers appear to have abandoned the very same people, the people of Rojava. On Monday, the SDF reported losing control of a prison holding ISIS militants in Hasakeh to government forces, with some reports suggesting ISIS fighters were being released. Nearby, forces of the international coalition were, according to our sources here at Novara Media, repeatedly asked by the SDF to intervene to keep those prisons safe. They were, we've been told, repeatedly promised help was coming, but in fact, they were abandoned, with dozens of SDF personnel killed by Syrian government-aligned fighters. Footage posted online has also apparently shown SDF fighters captured and then killed by government-aligned troops. That's ISIS-style stuff. Meanwhile, a second prison in Raqqa remains under threat. But there are also major fears for the city of Kobani, which sits on the Syrian-Turkish border and has a large Kurdish population. It's because of that demographic profile that there are growing fears of massacres if the Syrian government forces enter the city, as well as concerns that Turkey will assist them through airstrikes. In southeastern Turkey, large pro-Kurdish protests have been taking place, but they've faced harsh suppression by Turkish police. Rojava has been a bastion of multicultural and multi-religious living, as well as socialist governance, since the Syrian civil war. It was founded through a revolution driven by women soldiers in the YPS. Those are the Kurdish Women's Protection Units, operating socially in communities and councils, as well as militarily in the field of war. Just before we went live, the SDF announced it had formally entered a ceasefire pact with the Syrian government. Let's hope it holds. That's because earlier this week, Rojava declared a general mobilization against the threats of Syrian forces in what our source in Rojava described as an existential battle for the survival of the zone and its inhabitants. Earlier today, I was joined by Elif Sarican, editor of The Amagi, a website for Middle Eastern and North African news and politics. I began by asking her why the Syrian government was trying to take control of the ISIS prisons in Rojava.
Well, I mean, the Syrian government are trying to take essentially every part of Syria, and this was very clear quite early on in January when the talks between the Syrian Democratic Forces, the forces as many Novara viewers will know, are the forces that defeated ISIS with 11,000 martyrs. And when this talk stalled between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian interim government, this seemed to be also a signal to the Syrian government's sadly seeming unwillingness to continue negotiations about what the future of Syria could look like. And as some people may know, the interim president, Ahmed al-Shara, also known as Mohammed al-Jolani, former HTS, now dissolved HTS, former Al-Qaeda, former ISIS, has always said that they do not want a federal Syria. They do not want a decentralized Syria. They indeed want a centralized Syria. But where it seems to have gone wrong is there were some talks between the Syrian interim government and Israel in Paris, mediated by the US. And at that same time, there was talks between the SDF and other government forces in Damascus. And during those talks, the talks with the SDF was abruptly ended. And that's when the assault against Aleppo's Kurdish neighborhoods started. Now, we don't know exactly what that they will do with ISIS, the kind of prisoners that are in these ISIS prisons. But I think it's also important to realize there's been some images of some ISIS fighters being released from those. And, I don't know if this is useful for people, but when you see those fighters that are being released, you see them, plump and healthy. And the reason why I think that's significant is there's really not many prisons in the region, especially where people go in and come out looking healthier than they did when they went in. So we don't know exactly what the end game is, but I think the interim government had made it quite clear that they do not really believe in or have any kind of, willingness for a genuinely democratic Syria.
A source in Rojava told us that multiple calls had been made to the international coalition bases formed of US, UK and French military nearby. That source says that the coalition repeatedly promised to intervene to protect the prisons, but they never did. Why is that?
Well, I don't know exactly why that isn't, but I also, speaking to some people on the ground, was told some reports where the coalition forces kept saying that they were on their way, but then bizarrely kept claiming that they couldn't find their location. So kind of bizarre, but also unclear reports about that. To be honest, it seems, Aaron, that, there is some Trump plan here. As with many of Trump's plans, it's not always easy to decipher it. We don't exactly understand the full logic behind it. But I think what's important to understand is the facts that we know. The facts that we know is there was a negotiation meeting between Israel and the interim government in Paris. The reports from that suggest that Ahmed al-Shara has agreed for Israel to have its what they call sphere of influence in the south of Syria, so particularly the Golan and also some of the Druze areas. And it seems, or there is suggestions that for the US, that may have been enough for them to kind of, at least for the time being, de-invest from the protection of the Syrian Democratic Forces. Because again, as many people may know, there was still a small number of US soldiers around the north to essentially act as human shields, because there was a very clear understanding that if they withdrew, that there would be a full-blown Turkish assault and invasion on those areas. So we don't know exactly what deal has been made, but it seems like there was some deal made around the power, but also resource sharing of Syria that perhaps mean that the US feels like they can somewhat de-invest from many levels of support of the Syrian Democratic Forces.
So on Sunday, it appeared that a peace agreement had been reached between the Syrian government and authorities in Rojava. What's your view on that? Because there are claims that, for instance, rights to use and learn Kurdish language will be upheld. But at the same time, images that have been broadcast, which can be found online since then, don't really indicate a peaceful transition. And I suppose in addition to that, Elif, I'd want to ask, we know al-Jilani/al-Shara's background is ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Has that changed? Do people in that part of the world, that part of northern Syria, effectively view this as ISIS coming back? No real shift in the politics and the ideology of what is now the dominant political force in the region?
Well, I mean, to put it very clearly and bluntly, Aaron, it's basically, Jilani is now a jihadi in a suit. He's slightly trimmed his beard and he's put on a suit. And, there's, I think, a lot to discuss in how that emerged and essentially who prepared him for that role. And I think that would be really important perhaps to talk about at another time. But I think to just put it very briefly, there's very clear and credible reports that British think tanks essentially advised him for a year before he actually took over Syria from Assad, particularly took Damascus and kind of was able to declare himself as the president. Now, there was a ceasefire that was / kind of, agreement made between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the interim government. That seems to certainly have not been implemented. Even after that was declared, with all of its flaws, which I'll get into in a second, it was never implemented on the ground. Everyone who knows about Rojava probably would have heard about it through the resistance in Kobane, where ISIS was territorially defeated for the first time. And the city of Kobane essentially has been besieged. The surrounding areas and the roads leading to it have been blocked by the current government forces, and people have been preparing for self-defense in Kobane, and as well as literally every part of Rojava. And I think what's important to understand about the agreement as well, because there's been a lot of, I think some people, in a well-meaning way, but I think there's been a lot of ill will in how these so-called agreements have been discussed as well, including this, kind of what I actually called the sham decree that was declared by al-Shara, claiming that, Kurdish is now a national language, and Nowruz, the Kurdish New Year, is a national holiday. One thing to understand is he declared it as a national language, not as an official language, meaning that state schools that would be formed and funded by the government would not be able to teach in Kurdish. Kurdish can be taken as supplementary kind of lessons, just like in most other parts of the world, obviously, except from some countries in the region. And, the 21st of March is already a national holiday in Syria. It's Mother's Day. And he already declared that. So it's not an additional national holiday. So what also seems to be literally just before we spoke, there does seem to now be another ceasefire agreement between the SDF and the government forces. We don't know if this will be implemented either, but there seems to be a really big push for what the interim government were always pushing for, which was not a kind of special or autonomous status to the Syrian Democratic Forces, given that it governs a Kurdish majority area, or mostly Kurdish majority areas, but giving the opportunity for SDF fighters to individually join the centralized Syrian army. And we must note here that it's the centralized army of the Syrian Arab Republic. Jilani did not, or al-Shara did not change the name of Syria. It's still an Arab republic, despite all the minorities. And also, I just want to say that hearing reports from many minority communities, from the Druze to the Alawis in Latakia on the coastal areas. People are really, really afraid because there wasn't necessarily ideological kind of affiliation or kind of closeness between where the SDF governed and say the Druze in Sweden or the Alawis in Latakia, but there was a sentiment or an understanding that the maintenance or the defense or the status of Rojava, the northeast of Syria, meant that minorities in other parts of Syria can believe or have a sense of hope that things wouldn't get so bad for them. And they really, really acutely understand that the destruction of Rojava, a highly organized, militant society that is the most able to defend itself more than any other community in Syria, the destruction of would really mean the destruction of their communities, and they really understand this. So, people are kind of up and in the streets in other parts of Syria as well, understanding the concerns.
What kinds of resistance are we likely to see in response to these incursions being made now by the Turks and the sort of military of al-Shara al-Jilani's government? Because, of course, like you say, it's a very militant society, highly organized, but at the same time lost the backing of the US Air Force, and the Iranians and the Russians are no longer in the country to distract opposing forces. This is a highly organized national military against the SDF. What does that look like, and what might happen?
The images that we've seen, particularly since yesterday, is of, people, communes, local self-defense forces organizing and preparing essentially for a battle of survival. But also, there's not exact figures known of the SDF numbers, but some figures suggest that there's up to a force of 100,000 soldiers that are not only very well trained, but also have probably more battle experience than many of the other forces on the ground in Syria. And also we've seen images and videos of youth, women, old people, people from literally every corner of Kurdistan flocking to the borders, from North Kurdistan, so the southeast of Turkey, but also from South Kurdistan, the north of Iraq, flocking to the borders, demanding to cross to defend Rojava. I think what's important to understand is the Kurdish people in general are a very organized society. They also really understand, and there is, particularly in the last 14 years, there really has become a sentiment of Rojava being a red line for the Kurdish people, understanding that the defense of Rojava is the guarantor for the future of the Kurdish people in the region as a whole. Now, saying this and kind of delivering the reports from the ground of people very determined to resist, very determined to fight, organizing, and almost, excited to take on what they're calling this fight of a century. It's also important to understand that this is an asymmetrical war. As you said, particularly with the involvement of the Turkish army, the second largest NATO army, with an air force and its drones and all of its technologically advanced military equipment. If they get involved in a very heavy way, they've already been shelling certain parts of Rojava with drones of the Turkish army. If they get involved in a very active and heavy way, it would be an asymmetrical war. It's obviously not really possible to fight an air force when you don't have an air force. So I think this is where the pressure needs to be, if there is any pressure, particularly from people listening to this, is, if it was to be an equal war, I think there is a chance. Obviously, we still don't want people to die. Ultimately, the aim should always be peace and peaceful solutions to any conflict, because otherwise people die, and it's horrible. And it would be easy for me to sit in London and kind of celebrate war when I'm not in the midst of it. But unfortunately, the reality is that it would not be a symmetrical war.
And just before you go, Elif, for people who are concerned about all this, want to contribute in however small a way, where are their protests? What kinds of things can they do to try and minimize the worst case scenario here?
So there's, especially since last night, Aaron, there's been protests literally in every corner of, as I said, in Kurdistan, but also of Europe, and in Britain as well. There's protests in many cities. People, and also there already was protests in London today outside of Downing Street. There's another one at 7 o'clock outside the Foreign Office, and there'll be more protests happening all across the country. People can follow the Kurdistan Solidarity Network, who will be posting all the protests that are happening. But also, sometimes I guess it feels like, what does this actually do? But I think it is still important to write to our MPs just to say that these are the forces that, defeated ISIS, particularly territorially. And we have a duty to support them, and particularly ensure that there isn't a full-blown invasion, both by Turkey and also they're not, basically destroyed by the interim government.
That was Elif Sarican, editor of the Imagi, speaking with me earlier today. It's often said that the left aren't very patriotic, that they don't love the country. I always found that a little strange. After all, socialism is premised on the public good, focusing on the collective interests of society. So while Jeremy Corbyn might not call himself patriotic, he might not be hanging flags from lampposts, the policies he advances, like bringing rail operators into public ownership rather than letting be owned by overseas operators for profit, is essentially the same thing. It's putting the interests of this country and the people that live here first. Additionally, there's often been a bizarre line of attack, particularly from some on the right, namely that if you have a critique of the United States and disagree with Britain following Washington every single time, then you must hate this country. No, actually, I love it. That's why we should never repeat the idiocy of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq ever again. The media paints opposition to Britain's subordination to Washington as ideological, left-coded, and unrealistic. And yet, a startling new poll reveals the extraordinary lengths much of this country is willing to go to if Trump tries to annex Greenland. Asked how they think Europe should react in the event of the USA seizing the territory, just 5% of respondents said we should accept it, just roll over. So what might look like a majority opinion on X is actually around 1 in 20 people. A reminder, Twitter isn't real. Even among Reform voters, the most pro-Trump voters in Britain, that figure is just 18%, less than 1 in 5. 14%, almost 3 times more people, think Europe should retaliate militarily. We should go to war with Washington over Greenland. And meanwhile, 30% favour economic sanctions and tariffs. That is, of course, very aggressive, but there are no guns and bombs involved. The leading option, however, favoured by 33% of the electorate, is diplomatic. Ideally, of course, that's what happens. And ideally, it works. The point is, though, that with Trump, such tools are rarely effective. A reminder from that extraordinary data, 44% of Brits, almost half of the country, favour either sanctions or military intervention if Donald Trump comes good on his promise to acquire Greenland. Did I ever think I'd be saying that sentence 5 years ago? Absolutely not. I would have thought aliens landing was more probable, frankly. Presumably for much of the right, these people, that 44% of the public, aren't patriots for taking their medicine and rolling over and shutting up. Because, of course, if you really love this country, you do everything you're told by the Americans. But while only 1 in 20 Brits say Europe should just let Trump have Greenland, Richard Littlejohn, star columnist at the Mail, has gone one further. He'd like Donald Trump to buy Britain. Trump should raise his sights from Greenland and buy Britain instead. I'd take him, warts and all, over our hopeless, complete and utter lawyer of a PM any day. Littlejohn is a man so famously patriotic. He, of course, pens his columns from, you guessed it, America. He has his finger on the pulse, all the way from Florida. Over the last 40 years, nobody has done more to contribute to British stagnation than the boomer slot merchants, just like Littlejohn, who write columns for this country's right-wing press. There's a lot of blame to go around, but in my book, they're number one. Meanwhile, on the other side of the political divide, Zach Polanski says American soldiers should be given the boot from Blighty. The Green Party leader told the Guardian newspaper that American troops should leave the country and that Britain's military needed a proper strategic review. But beyond even that, Polanski thinks Britain should leave NATO and give up its nukes. The Guardian writes this. The Green Party leader said he supported the UK leaving NATO, even though that is not official Green Party policy. Donald Trump has so much domination within NATO that I don't believe it's possible to reform NATO from within, he said. He said he wanted to see the UK give up its nuclear weapons, saying he would try to persuade other nuclear-armed countries, including Russia, to do the same. If we're not willing to have conversations about peace and diplomacy, that part of those conversations look at everyone denuclearising, then what are we doing here, he said. So, to be clear, I don't agree with that. I agree with booting American soldiers out of the UK. Can't happen all at once, might take time, but I think it's definitely a long-term objective that is worthy of pursuit, particularly if American politicians and governments particularly if American politicians and leaderships continue down this path that Donald Trump has begun. I agree with that. What I don't agree with is on the nuclear weapons side. We should absolutely move away from Trident. We should end Britain's dependence on Trident. We do not have an independent nuclear deterrent in this country. It's a lie. It's a fugazi. It's make-believe. We haven't had one since Polaris. We lease the missiles from the Americans. We pay hundreds of billions of dollars for something we can't use fundamentally without the Americans. I don't care what anybody says. Oh, it's strategically independent. If we want to, we can fire them. Okay, fire one, and the Americans don't like it. You can't fire anymore. And by the way, I think you're absolutely delusional if you don't think they've all got a kill switch. You'd have to be incredibly naive to think that, in my view. To think these missiles don't have a kill switch. Of course they do. By the way, not only do I think they have a kill switch, I'm pretty sure we know they have a kill switch. But of course, that's not the sort of thing that our security apparatus would tell the public, which is paying the £100 billion plus for Trident. At which point, then you have a conversation about where do you go. I think we should have far fewer nuclear weapons. I think the world needs far fewer nuclear weapons. But renouncing them altogether, while Russia, China, America, France still have them, I think is unwise. Instead, you would want a multilateral, coordinated settlement to wind down numbers gradually. So countries still have that capability, but they don't vaporize enemy states if, heaven forbid, those weapons are ever deployed. I think that's more realistic, and I still think it makes for a much better world. Kieran, I didn't mention NATO. What's your view on NATO and Britain's nukes?
My view on NATO and Britain's nukes is, well, first of all, there's nothing to disagree with at all, Aaron, in what you said about Trident and the utter redundancy of it, ultimately, because of the kill switch that we suspect exists and which has in various forms been confirmed as existing. I think it's a tremendous waste of money. I think it's a carbuncle from a previous era. And I think it's extremely inefficient as a form of national security, not just financially, but in its the ability to deploy it, right? The extent to which it keeps us safe for the reasons that you talked about just now. My view of NATO is that NATO has created more danger in Europe than it has prevented. I think particularly NATO's kind of liberal, expansionist zeal in the kind of high liberal era of the 1990s and its eastward expansion to Russia, towards Russia. And I know we've ranged over this before, and I know it's controversial still with some people. I don't think it should be. I think it's pretty obvious that that NATO moving closer and closer to Russia's borders certainly spurred on rearmament in Russia, not nukes, of course, but rearmament in Russia, militarization, and the militarization of the buffer zones around its borders. Not making excuses for Russia. It's got its own internal dynamics, which spur, political games and incentives, which spur militarization as well. political incentives that prop up failing careers and all the rest of it. That was certainly an input into the kind of jingoism that we see emanating from Russia over the past 10, 15 years. So my view of NATO, I mean, I'm not going to go into loads of detail because we haven't got time for it, but my view is a pretty dim one.
I have to be clear about my views on NATO as well. I don't think we should be in NATO, but that's not because I do have an ideological aversion to NATO. NATO's dead, right? You can think it's good, you can think it's bad. Donald Trump killed it. It doesn't exist anymore. So if the Europeans are serious about collective security, then they should manage it themselves. And by the way, that's a really interesting conversation. The left is going to have to confront some really challenging orthodoxies it's held over the last 80 years. A lot of the peace movement, fundamentally, in my view, was premised on American global hegemony. It's really easy to be, peace and love if you've got this superpower across the Atlantic looking after you and having you under their umbrella. I believe in peace, but I'm not a pacifist. And also, by the way, just on nukes, so I think we should leave NATO, but that's because it's a dead letter, fundamentally. It's a dead letter when Trump is saying he wants Greenland, for God's sake. Also on nukes, do you really want Britain to give up nukes while the US and Israel has nuclear weapons? Do you really want to do that? Do you really want Benjamin Netanyahu to have a weapon that this country doesn't have? Let's say you have a left-wing government at some point. What do you think would happen if there's an imperialist right-wing US government? You've got Israel. What do you think would happen? You think that's a good thing? So I would have an independent capability. You don't need to have many warheads. Built here, not dependent on US technology. I'm sure that'll upset some people, actually. But I think it's very pragmatic, I'm sorry. I don't want the Israelis to have something this country doesn't have. I think it's genuinely plausible that Netanyahu nukes somewhere. It wouldn't be a strategic weapon. It wouldn't be like a hydrogen bomb, but it might be a small tactical nuclear weapon. Heaven forbid. By the way, one of the miracles of the last 80 years is that we didn't use this technology after Hiroshima. Nobody used it. I did an interview with Serhiy Plokhy recently. He's got a great new book out on the development of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. And by the way, it'll be a miracle, even bigger miracle, if we go another 80 years and nobody uses this stuff. So I care deeply about it, but I wouldn't want to get rid of them while the Israelis and the Americans have them. No, thank you. And the Russians, let's be honest. These are entities that really have very little interest in a democratic, socialist government in this country or anywhere else in Europe. No, thank you. Britain's politicians claim to care about free speech. That's hard to believe for a number of reasons, not least the fact that Palestine Action has been prescribed as a terrorist organisation. So, if I choose to wear a t-shirt with the logo Palestine Action on it, I could face 6 months in prison. If I write the sentence, I support Palestine Action on X, I'm committing a serious offence, and again, could face up to 6 months at His Majesty's leisure. This is, to any sane person, ridiculous. It's not only unjust and undermines a basic liberty, but is also a complete waste of police resources. And now those seeking to defend the rights of Palestine Action and its supporters have an unlikely ally, the US State Department. The Telegraph reports this. Sarah Rogers, Donald Trump's free speech czar, she's also Under Secretary of State, said the arrests in regards to Palestine Action were, quote, censoring free speech and did more harm than good. More than 2,000 people have been arrested for expressing support for Palestine Action since it was prescribed as a terror group in July last year. Ms. Rogers, the US State Department's Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, said that the public should be allowed to say they back the group. I would have to look at each individual and each prescribed organisation, she told Semaphore. I think if you support an organisation like Hamas, then depending upon whether you're coordinating, there are all these standards that get applied. This Palestine Action group, I've seen it written about. I don't know what it did. I think if you just merely stand up and say, I support Palestine Action, then unless you are really coordinating with some violent foreign terrorist, I think that censoring that speech does more harm than good. If I said that on BBC Questions, I might be cancelled. Not even by the right, by the centrists. The Labour Party, The Observer, how dare you? Sonia Soda. They'd come after me. How dare you? But then we've got somebody at the State Department who is serving under the most right-wing president that's occupied the Oval Office, certainly in my lifetime, certainly I think in the last 100 years, probably ever. Maybe somebody might say Teddy Roosevelt. He was very racist. You might say Nixon. This guy's pretty bad. Even she's saying this is crazy. Unlike a lot of right-wingers in this country, it seems at least some of their fellow travellers on the other side of the Atlantic are vaguely consistent in defending free speech, which I suppose is always likely, given it's a cornerstone of their constitution rather than just being a vibe, as is the case in this country. In Britain, for the right, free speech is just a way of owning people, right? But when it's your side censoring, you don't say anything. Free speech, just for the people I agree with, doesn't work like that. Kieran, do we need a left-wing campaign for free speech in this country?
I think we do. Well, I mean, I don't know if we need a campaign, but I think that freedom of speech, saying something like "I'm a free speech absolutist" has been completely and utterly sullied by and abused by the likes of Elon Musk, who says he's a free speech absolutist, buys X in order to reflect that wisdom and those principles, and obviously does everything. But so I think, but I've always considered myself, I've always thought that the only sane position for the left to take really is one that does accept free speech absolutism, maybe short of only direct incitement, perhaps, but short of that, I think I would count myself, willing to hear a great deal of very unpleasant things, simply to maintain the ability to say all of the pleasant things and all of the things that I do agree with, not sound too much like a pound shot Voltaire. And I think that the left maybe has failed on some of this. We've had a big backlash against woke and so on. And I think all of that has been litigated and there's been a lot of discourse on it, not least, in our own Novara over the past kind of year or two. So I don't want to pick low-hanging fruit or tread ground that's already been trodden, but you're absolutely right that there is, however flawed it is, there is this kind of difference in the American system and in the way that Americans tend to treat free speech in their discourse versus the United Kingdom, where it seems that everything is up for grabs. We don't have a written constitution. Well, we do have a written constitution. I can hear Peter Hitchens complaining in my head. We do have a written constitution. We don't have a codified constitution, which obviously is, I think, the key nodal difference. And I would be in favour of much more stringent laws around free speech, preventing the kind of prohibition of Palestine Action that we've seen over the weaponization of proscription of a peaceful movement and a peaceful group at the behest of the Israel lobby. And it's just one example of the kind of victims that you will have when you have such open and free legislation around, or kind of lack of systemic control around freedom of speech. So I definitely think that the left should hold as close to a free speech absolutist position as possible. And the hypocrisy of the centre, you're right, Sonia Soda and her ilk, is staggering, but I don't really believe those people believe in anything, actually.
Yeah, they sort of believe in their little talking points to get them on TV, and that's about it, Go on, you was going to say something, Kieran, before I rant. Let me have my final rant, but you go first.
Well, no, just to echo what you're saying, Aaron, they're weather vanes. They blow with the wind. They'll blow with the wind. What's acceptable in 2017 is no longer acceptable in 2024, if only enough of their peers say it's not acceptable. It is a hive mind in the worst possible sense.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, really, to watch it as you get older. I mean, when you're young, you sort of think people arrive at their own conclusions independently, but actually to see, as you say, it's a hive mind. The centrist hive mind, it's all status games, following one another. It's like what's that horror movie? With the worm and they're all taped to one another. I'm going to sound the human centipede. It's like the human centipede of consent. They said it, then they said it, then they said Dan Hodges and Sonia Soda, then this person and this person and this person. And they end up saying the same thing. 5 years' time, they'll all be saying, Mark Carney. I have to agree with Mark Carney thought with Anglophone characteristics for a new era, right? Xi Jinping thought, but for an Anglophone context. They'll agree with that because the human centipede of centrism told them to. On the free speech thing, I couldn't agree more. Very, very important. I think we've made plenty of mistakes on that, I have to be honest, over the last 15 years. Because, to be quite frank, the right in this country do not care about it. It's a joke for them. For them, it's a way of owning the left. Not for all of them, but for many people, it's just a way of owning the left. And I think we don't have that. We don't have that constitutional tradition in this country, right? I can say what I like. It's written down here, tiny document, look it up, read it. People think they can do that, and the police go, actually, no, you can't. People don't know their rights because guess what? In terms of a codified constitution, they don't have any. Kieran, thank you for joining me this evening.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And I do like it here, not least because they know how to keep a building warm when it's -10 outside. But I do miss you, Aaron, and I do miss the team. So I'm looking forward to being back in the studio soon.
Well, we miss you too. Although I have to say, I do like southern Sweden. I do like it a lot.
Beautiful place.
Beautiful place. Beautiful people. I'm talking, of course, in a non-aesthetic sense. Thank you, Kieran, for joining me. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. I thought it was a good show tonight. Come back tomorrow for another live stream at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.